I consider kick drums to be one of the most important parts of any electronically produced track. Not only are they one of, if not the loudest element in your track, but the listener is going to hear it dozens, if not hundreds of times in a single track. Because the kick is so fundamental, it is often very influential to how the track is made and how the track is mixed, whether we feel that it is or not. If the kick is short and snappy with a precise, tight transient, your track might end up taking on a more techy, tight feel. If the kick is deep, dark, and thumpy, the track might take on that sort of characteristic. If the kick is very bright, then in the mixing stage, maybe your mix will be mixed just as bright because that's what you're matching it to, consciously or subconsciously. For all of these reasons, and so many I haven't mentioned, is why I think it's important to be very deliberate with what kick drum you use in your song. So in this video, I want to talk about some things to consider with your kick drum, as well as some ways to manipulate those considerations. We'll be talking partially kick drum philosophy, sound design, and mixing, all intertwined and in combination. So let's explore. Firstly, what is the job of your kick drum? Depending on the genre you're making and the section of the track, the character of your kick drum can be drastically different. The majority of the time, especially in dance music, your kick drum is meant to drive the groove, covering a vast swath of frequencies, both high and low. But how high and how low and for how long will make a big difference. So let's touch on genre. A very obvious example of a kick filling a specific role is a hardstyle kick drum. It's long, distorted, and often fills the role of a bass line. In contrast, a trap kick might be quite short, and if it's meant to be layered with an 808, it might not even reach down to the lowest of lows, or at least not for very long. In dubstep, the kick might have a quick, sharp transient to cut through the mid basses, with a deep but short sub bass to hit all the way at the bottom. In a hip-hop track, the same sharp transient might feel out of place, so you may opt for a slightly darker kick with a softer transient. If there's no 808, maybe the lows could even ring out to fill the role of a bass. The section of a track is also important. On a verse, for example, the kick might not be as hard or fill out the same spectrum, so that in the chorus, the new kick feels fresh and bigger in comparison. Don't shy away from using multiple kicks through your song, or even in multiple kicks in a section, depending on the role. Once you've decided on the style of your track or the role of your drum, it's time to pick one, or make one. The first factor to consider is the low end. When I say low end, I'll be talking low, mids, and down. So approximately 150 hertz and below, though you could argue 250 hertz and below, deep, low rumble, and a bit of that mid-range punch. When it comes to the low end, there's several factors to consider: the pitch, the punch, the length, and the harmonics. For those who prefer picking samples versus making them, I'll circle back on all these factors. If you're designing the kick, this is quite simple. You merely pick a note that's in your key. I'll demonstrate an operator, though you could do this in a plethora of synths. I usually start by trying out the root, but if that feels too low or too high, depending on where it is in the octave, I may opt for a fifth above or even another note depending on the context. In this case, let's just say my root note is E. So let's drop this down in a sub-range. It's important to consider how low it's going to go. I opted for sub, but perhaps you want a higher mid-range kick. I'm going to go quite low with this one. I often opt for it to go down into sub-range. However, if the sub or 808 is already quite punchy or focal, you may opt to have a higher, knockier type of kick. After you've selected your pitch, let's create some punch. Punch is less about the dynamic of the sound and more about the pitch of the sound. Pitch from punch, meaning going from a high pitch down to the root pitch very quickly. How quickly and how distant determines the punch. So with a pitch envelope, we can set this up quite easily. We set the peak and we set the decay. Consider the distance, speed, and the curve. That isn't to say dynamic doesn't serve any role here. Is the tail going to be quieter than the punch? Are you going to have a big sausagey kick that rolls off at the end? All of those factors do matter. The attack can also help if you're starting from a really high pitch and you want to get a bit of the initial knockout. I'm going to stick with my 2 octaves. I generally work in octaves. And I'm going to add a little bit of release so we don't hear the sound of the sub cutting off. You can also change the sustain. Though I like to keep things pretty sausagey until the end. Next to consider is the length. Length is actually very important because in electronically produced music, side chaining to the kick is important not only for the feel, but saving energy in the mix. If your kick is too long, it'll take up a huge amount of the mix. Though if it's something like an 808, then you would want it to be really long. The length of the punch influences how long your kick can be too. If the length of the punch takes a while, then you're going to need to lengthen the kick to land back at the root note and sustain it for a period. If you have a short, quick punch, then your kick may not need to be as long. I'm going to go for a healthy middle ground. Consider how long the release goes for too. If you don't want it to just cut kind of quickly like mine does, you can extend this even further. Release can be nice when you're designing 808s because you can have that nice natural fade out, which you can then resample, but I'm going to keep things relatively tight. Finally, let's talk about the harmonics. Although a nice sine wave like I've been using is a great starting point, harmonics can really shape the character of the sound. Going extreme with effects like distortion will take you as far as a hardstyle kick, while more subtle uses can help fill out the harmonic spectrum and beef up your kick. There's no right or wrong distortion type to use. I say play around with different plugins, different settings, see what feels right to you, what's right for the track. It's all about exploring. You can also get creative and use techniques like FM synthesis to add harmonics, or harmonic layering with different oscillators can help as well. For example, we could add a bit of FM to this sound, even just to the punch. Or we could layer that. Maybe even the fifth. Again, no right or wrong way. Play around, depends on the kick, depends on what your ear likes. Now when it comes to picking kick samples, you want to consider all of these factors at once, while also knowing that if you need to, you can change these with effects. That being said, there are limits to how you can change a sample, so try and pick one that gets you close from the beginning. Once you have a sample selected, let's manipulate it to tape. While we're working with the low end, you have to think about how it affects the rest of the kick as well. Let's start with the pitch. With the pitch, you can go about it in 2 primary ways. You can pitch the whole sample up and down, but note that it changes both the length and the pitch of the higher harmonics. I don't recommend using warp modes to maintain the length, as that can degrade the quality, though perhaps you might find that desirable. You can also change the pitch with a frequency shifter. This changes the pitch of the sound linearly across the frequency spectrum, meaning this allows you to change the pitch of the low end while keeping the high end closer to its original character. This may introduce phase issues, which may eat up a bit of extra headroom, so it's a bit of a tit for tat. If you struggle to figure out the pitch of the kick sample, there's a few methods you could do. You could try looking at it in a spectrum. If your spectrum doesn't look like mine, you can limit the volume range so that only the loudest note is appearing. With kicks, it's often the sub. That can help me identify the note. You could look in an EQ, boosting certain notes, and then pitching the sample around until it resonates. that seems to be where it peaked the highest. I can see this is approximately a G sharp or an A. So if we go down, G, F sharp, F, E. I know that's correct too because the sample was labeled, but if it hadn't been, that would have told me. You can also try looping the kick drum in a sampler and see if a tuner will pick it up. So there we go, it's an E. You can also render a sine wave and try comparing it. So let's render a C, which I know is incorrect. Let's drop it down into subrange. Let's try and line it up. It's approximately there. And then let's pitch this around until it lines up a bit better. So something like that. That looks a bit closer there. Let's test this out. That looks a bit better. You have to go into it knowing the kick is going from a high pitch to a low pitch, so it might not sustain the same length, but approximately there looks like where it lines up the most. And we had to go up 4 semitones, so it was a C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E. If you've exhausted all these techniques and you can't hear it, just go with feel. There's nothing wrong with that. Now for sample punch, there's several ways you could change it. You could approach it with dynamic, which is especially nice for softening kick drums. For example, just adding a nice fade at the front can just soften a kick drum up. You can even increase dynamic and crossfade to make the transient a bit louder. You could use a transient designer. There's so many different transient designers that I'm not going to go into them, but they're nice for both adding attack and subtracting. An EQ can even be nice for punch, targeting specific frequencies where the punch exists. Like the click of the sound, or finding the mid-range punch, which would happen at the beginning of the kick more than at the end. And you can get creative. For example, you could use a sampler to add or subtract punch. We could use the built-in pitch envelope to add further punch, similarly to how we did with the sine wave itself. Or you can even subtract punch by starting from a negative value. Ooh, see how that kind of darkened the kick? My ear liked that. So you could always darken it and then compensate by turning the highs back up. That's a completely different character than that. As for length, you're a bit more limited, but fading can go a long way. Sometimes kicks just ring out far too long, and it's nice to just come in and shorten them. Depending on the sample, you can even cut up kicks to shorten them. So let's start from this trough in the sample. And let's go to this trough here. Let's try and line them up, their lowest point. Something like that. Add a little crossfade. And then we can shorten the tail too. Now we can get like really tight short kick drums that reach the root note a bit quicker. This might not have been the best example, but I have done this and had it sound good. Finally, harmonics. Working with a kick sample works very much the same way. You can add as desired with distortion and FM, or if you need to remove, EQ can go a long way. If you have a sample that started out with too much harmonics, let's say this is how the sample came, don't be afraid to automate EQs and filters. You don't have to remove frequencies for the whole sample. You could remove it just for portions. See how that completely changed things? Had we just subtracted the whole time, it wouldn't have had the same effect. Now that we've talked about the bottom, let's talk about the top. When it comes to designing a top, you can make it in the same device you made the bottom, or layer from somewhere separately. And with the top, we'll be considering the same things: pitch, punch, length, and harmonics. This time your options are a lot more open-ended. You can make the top end with noise, FM, other types of synthesis techniques, or layering a sample on top. Personally, I find cutting out samples and scooping out the bottoms to be my preferred method because it's an easy way to get tons of different characteristics. I'll design one in this example, but note you can get really creative. So let's layer up something that sounds like it could be cohesive. And I'll be using a combination of FM from noise and an initial pitch to have it kind of match both tonally and be quite noisy. If we need to fill out the middle, I'll even introduce some FM just in the middle. The pitch envelope and length are really important here too. As you introduce midtones, if things are too long, it can be kind of strange. And the length of the high end and mid are all really important. This can take practice to get it to sound the way you want for the right context you want. Knowing when to use what type of punch also takes practice too, but you'll quickly develop a taste for what you like. Don't be afraid to use what effects you have at your disposal. For example, a filter can go a long way. Processing is really important here too. If you had made this separately, not in this device, for example, the right processing can really glue the top end and the bottom end together. Try everything from EQ, compression, distortion, transient designers, or whatever else to glue your elements together. it's really important just to play around. When it comes to sample selection, you can pick a kick drum where you already like the highs and the lows together, or you can just layer some highs from multiple samples and lows from multiple samples. So if I have these two kicks here, we could go about it multiple ways. We could take the lows from one, and the punch from another, and we can play with the same processing to glue them together. We can pitch them around. I actually don't mind that one if this was a bit shorter. That sounds pretty good. Alternatively, we could take the front from one and the sub from another and try and combine them. This is where phase alignment can be really nice. We can find a portion of this sample where it looks like things might have lined up, and we can fuse them to make a new kick. That also works too. You can really Frankenstein all these ideas together, taking low frequencies from one, tails from another, combining multiple kicks. I've definitely combined 4 or 5 kicks into one before. And you can even use a combination of synthesis and sample selection to layer them together. Whatever you do, just be precise, be deliberate, and trust your ears as to what sounds good. So once you have the base of your kick, B-A-S-E base of your kick, both the highs, mids, and lows combined, we can also get creative with processing. For example, short reverse sounds can actually go a long way. This can be a fun way to soften a kick and add a little bit of character that the listener might not even pick up on. You hear just that made a totally different style of kick drum. Let's pitch it up. And let's realign that. It's hard to notice that. But that has a totally different character with just a tiny little suck into the sound. Adding noise or other texture can go a long way as well. Ableton's erosion device is a really easy way to do this, where you could just automate the amount up and down. You can even do it subtly after the transient. Just adds that little bit more. It can also mask layers that aren't super cohesive. It's really up to you how to get creative. Some people like to layer hi-hats into their kicks. I find this can be a bit too noisy sometimes to hear it throughout the whole song. But that doesn't mean it's wrong. Now, if your sample's starting to distort, processing all the layers together can really help. For example, we could just clip the top of this off and save that little bit of headroom. I like to even do variants of kick drums where some are a bit more beefy and some are backed off. Some might not have the same high end. Some might not be as long. Maybe I would flatten all of those, and then in a track I have a selection of 5 different kick drums, all based off the same kick drum, but then they can all kind of fill different roles. So those are all sort of the factors that I consider while designing and integrating a kick drum into my track. There's lots of other ways you can get creative as well, and in the next video I'm going to explore one of those ideas. We're going to be diving into something we didn't talk at all about, which is adding character through room sound and reverb. Until then, enjoy designing your perfect kick drum.